Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Why You Should Add Geothermal to Your Service Offering. This event, brought to you by the news, is sponsored by ClimateMaster. ClimateMaster is the world's largest and most progressive manufacturer of geothermal heat pumps. I'm your moderator, Barb Checkett-Hanks. Thanks for joining us. Today's expert presenter is Paul Boney. Paul is the Director of Residential Market Development for ClimateMaster, which includes responsibility for technical installer and loop installation training, utility relations, and other GHP market development efforts. He became involved in the GHP industry in the late 1980s as a utility demand-side program developer. Paul has extensive hands-on experience in the ground source heat pump installation business, having started and served as the operating manager of a utility-owned GHP installation company. He also has expertise in the promotion and market development of GHPs at the national, regional, and local levels. He earned his MBA from the University of Nevada, Reno with Beta Gamma Sigma honors and a BS with honors from Kansas State University's College of Agriculture. He also completed the NRECA Management Internship Program. He is an International Ground Heat Pump Association certified GHP trainer and serves on the IGS HPA Training Committee. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's presenter. Please welcome Paul Boney.
Thank you, Barb, and thank you to all who are attending today, depending on which time zone you're in, good afternoon or good morning. The purpose of today's presentation is to bring you folks up to speed on what's going on in the ground source heat pump industry, and in particular, what government organizations, utilities, and utility regulators and politicians are doing in regards to ground source, and they really are developing a strong interest in this technology. So I want to give you an overview of some of the tools and policies that are being contemplated and actually implemented across the country that are going to accelerate the deployment of this geothermal system installations. And I get to do that in about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions. So I'm going to go a little fast. Please make your questions as we go, and then we'll answer those at the end. So we're in this post-election week, and I think it's fair to say that even before the election and now certainly afterwards, our government officials are very interested in a couple things. Those include creating jobs to get our economy moving again and put people back to work, especially in the construction trades, improving the financial well-being of all American families, and there's still a strong interest in both state houses and in Washington to stay focused on the environment and particularly ways to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And even more importantly, I think now, and especially since the Gulf spill, to find ways to reduce our use of oil and natural gas, and especially imported oil and natural gas. And I think there's also a mandate that came out of this election that how can we do that without raising taxes or raising folks' energy bills? And ground source heat pumps have a role to play in all of those platforms, and we'll talk about that as we go forward today. So the first thing I want to bring to your attention is why are ground source heat pumps important to this policy? Well, buildings are 40% of the primary energy consumption in the United States, and as a consequence, almost 40% or 39% of the total U.S. carbon in our economy come from buildings. And as this chart shows, heating, water heating, and space conditioning or air conditioning really are the single biggest components of that building energy footprint and consequently that carbon footprint. Well, ground source heat pumps attack that end use. This chart that I'm showing you now shows that by focusing just on energy efficiency for both electricity and fossil fuels, which would include natural gas and propane and fuel oil, we can take 65% of the energy efficiency, or I should say energy efficiency can meet 65% of the carbon reductions that have been identified as necessary to reduce our carbon to where folks think it should be. So we say that's not the low-hanging fruit, but energy efficiency is really the fruit that's on the ground. It's the easiest way to meet these efficiency goals, to meet these carbon-saving goals, and in the process save folks a lot of money on their energy bills for their homes and businesses. Well, how do ground source heat pumps meet that objective? Ground source heat pumps, for a lack of a better term, are a lever. 1 kW of electricity from the grid combined with the energy that can be stored or moved from the earth can deliver 4 to 6 kW of heating or cooling to a building or a structure. Or a simple way to put that are ground source heat pumps are 400 to 600% efficient. So if you replace a system that is less than 100% efficient, for a conventional furnace, or a system that has a lower EER or SEER, with a ground source heat pump, you can lever the grid and lever that electricity to meet these energy-saving goals, and energy converts to carbon. So this is another chart that shows the same thing. This is a residential chart. Across the country, on average, heating and air conditioning accounts for about 60% of a residential home's total energy use, and hot water adds another 13%. Well, if you put a ground source heat pump on that home, the loop takes almost 50% of that thermal energy out of the building, and because that energy is coming to and from the ground. And now the remaining energy footprint of the building, the heating, air conditioning, and water heating, becomes the equivalent almost of the thermal loads that are associated with lighting, appliances, and miscellaneous plug loads. So ground source heat pumps take half the energy that would normally be consumed by a building. They convert that to renewable energy from the ground, and that's how we get energy savings and carbon savings. Now, we've known this for a long time. This is a study that was done by, at the time, one of the largest geothermal retrofits in the country. This is Fort Polk, Louisiana. This is data from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the report was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy. And so there were a massive retrofit of over 4,000 homes and buildings at Fort Polk. And they went back after that retrofit and actually looked at the before and after energy usage as it was metered for the base. And here's what the ground source heat pump retrofit did. It reduced 33% of the kilowatt hours that were being consumed by the base. It lowered the summer peak demand of the base by 43%. And it improved the load factor, the electric load factor to serve the base from 52% to 62%. So in essence, it stretched the system that delivers electricity to the base so that more kilowatt hours were moved over that existing peak. That makes the electric system more efficient, and that allowed the energy company to basically spread their fixed cost over more kilowatt hours, which is a way that utility companies can keep pressure off of rates. So this retrofit was done a long time ago. This was one of the first measured data in the country, and these numbers still hold today. And again, the difference in that before and after system energy use, that equals carbon emission savings. So the folks who study carbon, and again, this is some DOE data, have come to the conclusion that about 300,000 ground source heat pump retrofits would equal the carbon emissions that come from a conventional 500 megawatt coal plant. And a 500 megawatt coal plant could serve up to 500,000 homes, so that basically shows that by using ground source heat pumps, we can lever our existing coal-fired power plants or new coal-fired power plants, save the carbon emissions, and actually those plants could come online or stay online, and the carbon savings could come from energy retrofits. When a ground source heat pump goes online and replaces an existing air conditioner and fossil fuel furnace, there is a net carbon savings of somewhere between 4 to 10 metric tons a year per home, and that's because fossil fuel furnaces and conventional air source heat pumps and air conditioners have a carbon footprint, and when we get to that 400 or 500% efficiency, we lower that total carbon footprint. Now, when we take ground source heat pumps and combine them with carbon-free electricity that comes from either wind or solar or waves or nuclear power, we can now have carbon-free electricity with a ground source heat pump, and that goes to carbon-free heating and cooling and water heating. Now, I've done some studies here in Colorado where I'm at, and if a single-family residential home with a 4-ton heating load were to operate on carbon-free electricity, that would result in about 10 metric tons of carbon savings a year for that house using carbon-free electricity due to the efficiency of the ground source heat pump. Let's talk a little bit about jobs. This is my math on how many folks it takes to put in a ground source heat pump, and I think my numbers are very conservative, but I've come to the conclusion that there's at least 5 jobs created or saved for every 100 homes that are retrofitted with geothermal heat pumps. Others numbers I've seen range from 8 to 10 jobs per 100 retrofits, depending on the assumptions people make. But at the end of the day, if we start doing more and more ground source heat pump retrofits, we'll create jobs, and those jobs will be in the construction trades, and that'll help put people back to work. And the construction trade unemployment rate is very high right now, and it's a significant contributor to the high unemployment we face as a country. Now, there's been over 1 million geothermal heat pumps installed in the United States and Canada since the 1970s. And actually, ground source heat pumps have been going in since the 1940s and 50s. So we have a strong base. The technology has been proven installation by installation over the past 20-some years. And so it's not like we're talking about a new whiz-bang technology that we need to learn about. This is an established technology that's been around for a long time. This chart shows the growth of ground source heat pumps as an industry over the years. And you can see the last couple of years when we went into this economic recession that we were supposedly coming out of, ground source heat pump sales actually went up. And so ground source heat pumps have continued to increase year over year. We think the industry will again show an increase in sales in 2010 over 2009. So this is an area that continues to grow, and if you're in the heating and air conditioning business, this is a growth opportunity for you if you get on this ground source heat pump growth curve. So let's compare the success in the United States with about 1 million units, and say we're around 100,000 units a year. That looks pretty good, but let's compare ourselves to Europe. This chart shows market penetration of ground source heat pumps in different European countries, and you can see the Swedes actually are at over 90% market penetration for ground source heat pumps in new homes. In the United States, we're down below 3%. So if we compare ourselves to other countries, we have a long way to grow in this industry, and so that tells me that there's quite a future here. There's some initiatives going on in Europe that will actually accelerate this even more. Great Britain has announced a 1 million geothermal heat pump retrofit initiative. So why are the Europeans so far ahead of the United States on a technology that really started in the U.S.? Well, the North Sea is starting to run out of gas and oil, and the next alternative for heating fuel for residential and commercial applications for Western Europe happens to be Russia. And I don't want to pick on the Russians, and if there's any listening, but they have there's a history there of what some embargoes and whatnot. So the Europeans have decided they'd rather be dependent on their homegrown electricity to provide heating for their homes the natural gas that they have to import from folks that may want to give them a price shock or a service disruption in the future. Well, not to be left behind, the United States, through the Department of Energy, has decided that they really want to see ground source heat pumps growth in our country. So they've announced what they call the industry roadmap for growth, and they want to see 1 million ground source heat pumps installed annually. So every year, see at least 1 million ground source heat pumps installed in the U.S. by 2017. Now, that would take about 3.3 million installations to get us to 2017. There's about 1 million units installed now, so you can see between now and 2017, they'd like to see 2.3 million more installations. So that, again, looks like a pretty strong market incentive, and I'm glad you're here to listen on how you might be able to take part of that. And why is this goal important? Well, again, if we go back to this carbon, the calculations are that would save 26 million metric tons annually of CO2, and over the lifetime of those units, if they lasted 20 years, it would be 520 million metric tons of CO2 savings. And there's their job estimation that says they'd create up to 100,000 new jobs or save up to 100,000 new jobs, again, in the construction industry if we hit that goal. Now, that sounds like a big number, but when you compare it to the existing market for heating and air conditioning replacements, that's about 6 to 8 million units a year. So really the feds are saying if we could get to 1/6 to 1/8 of the current replacement market for conventional equipment, that would do great things for the nation's carbon goals. It would put a lot of people to work and would help people save a lot of energy. Now, there's some barriers that the Department of Energy has also identified in why we need to get to that growth rate. What kind of barriers do we have to take out of the way? The first barrier is the higher cost of installation. Traditionally, ground source heat pumps, and it depends by market, cost a third to sometimes as much as twice as much as a conventional system. That's also very dependent. That price disparity is very dependent on the quality of the system that's being compared to the geothermal. Now, I will tell you that the federal government, through Energy Star and other programs, and individual states through their codes, have really started to pay attention to the quality of installations that go in the heating and air conditioning new and retrofit markets. So we're going to see that price disparity fall as the quality requirements for conventional system installations go up. Other barriers that have been identified are the lack of heating and air conditioning dealer interest. And then if dealers are interested, they still have to get through the experience curve of installing ground source heat pumps. And there's still limited consumer education. There's parts of the country where there's high consumer awareness of ground source heat pumps, and there's parts of the country where folks haven't even heard the term before. But the thing that is the single biggest barrier, in my opinion, and one that we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about today, is this lack of long-term affordable financing. Because ground source heat pumps cost more to install up front, it's that need for people to see a positive cash flow from low-interest, high-term financing that is a barrier, and we're going to talk about some programs across the country that are addressing that also. So let's take these barriers one at a time and talk a little bit about what the federal government and state governments and utilities are doing to overcome those. So this Geothermal Heat Pump Roadmap, which is a collaborative of the Department of Energy, the National Renewable Energy Lab, industry, research organizations, and policymakers across the country, is really targeting consumer education and consumer financing and basically market development. So here's what they're doing on the consumer education front. They're taking advantage of the fact that there's already a good base of consumers who want green products. So if you go back to earlier where we need to capture 1/6 to 1/8 of the existing replacement market to get to this 1 million units a year, well, look at these statistics. A third of all consumers say they systematically look for and purchase green products. 16% of U.S. consumers reported that they will only buy green products, or they're systematic shoppers. And 24% said they're willing to pay a higher price premium for buying green, and all of those numbers are up from prior surveys. So there's already a consumer base that's receptive to the benefits of ground source heat pumps, and that consumer base is big enough to meet the the needs to get to 1 million units a year. And then there's more statistics. 60% of consumers say that they already use energy efficiency appliances, and 95% say they want to use energy efficient appliances in the future. So the federal government, through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, has already put a significant amount of money into efforts that are promoting geothermal heat pumps across the country for both commercial and residential applications. And this is just sort of a highlights list here. So there's $6 billion in energy efficiency and conservation grants, $5 billion in weatherization assistance, $4.5 billion that's going to upgrade federal building efficiency. And then there's the military bases. There's $6.5 billion that's going to efficiency in military bases. And I work a lot of shows across the country. And a few years ago, when the folks that were the military base energy guys would come up to me, they'd ask about how does a geothermal heat pump system work. Today, when I talk to those same folks, they're basically saying, I've been told I'm going to do a geothermal retrofit. What do I need to know to be successful? So the military gets it, and there's a lot of geothermal activity going on in bases. That spills over into other markets. Same thing's happening in the public housing market. There's $4 billion that's been made available for public housing efficiency improvements, and we're starting to see a lot of activity with geothermal there. And then the icing on the cupcake, there were $62 million specifically set aside in the Department of Energy to promote ground source heat pump technology. And at the end of the day, all of those efforts are promoting and buying a lot of consumer education, both in the commercial and residential market. So let's go to the next list of barriers, the lack of heating and air conditioning dealer interest, and then the lack of dealer experience. So I was told right before we started that there were 300 folks who had pre-signed up for this conference, so that tells me the interest is out there. And we do seminars and training across the country. Our company, we've put over 1,000 dealers through installation training in the last year. So that tells me that the interest is there and the industry is doing its part to make sure that the training's in place so folks can do a good job. The other exciting thing that's going on in our industry is, for the first time ever, we have a trade association called the GEO, or the Geo Exchange Organization. And the GEO is working closely with ICSPA, the International Ground Source Heat Pump Association, which is based at Oklahoma State University. And ICSPA has always been the leader in developing new techniques, new grouts, new ways to do boreholes. So we really have a strong alliance between an industry association and the research arm at Oklahoma State University that I think will really carry our industry forward. And for the first time with a trade association, we now have a focus where we can work with policymakers, utilities, and other key influencers in the market to really help meet that 1 million unit growth curve. And did I mention jobs? I think that if you're listening and you're running a heating and air shop, the chances are pretty good that you just don't have the level of work you had 2 years ago. And I think we're seeing a lot of interest in both heating and air conditioning shops and drillers that are looking at ground source heat pumps as a way to keep their people working and to grow their business and to basically get the work that they've lost over the last couple of years. So we talked a little bit about the higher cost of installation, but that barrier really fell with this federal tax credit. Just in the last year and a half, ground source heat pumps are now eligible for federal tax credit incentives for both commercial and residential applications. And actually, after January of this year, it'll be the only heating and air conditioning technology that's eligible for a federal tax credit. So this is a summary of the residential federal tax credit for ground source. 30% of the total ground source heat pump system cost, or the incremental cost required for the ground source heat pump system, is eligible for a federal tax credit. There's no cap on the credit, and it can be used to offset the alternative minimum tax, and it can be combined within the other tax credits, and if the tax credit is too big to use in 1 year, it can be carried forward into future years. So in essence, this tax credit covers a third of the cost of installing a ground source heat pump system. That means in most parts of the country, if not all parts of the country, The incremental cost between a ground source heat pump system and a conventional heating and air conditioning system is at parity in new construction and probably in retrofit. So to be eligible for that tax credit, it has to be a home in the U.S. That makes sense. And it includes homes, condominium buildings, individual condominium units, mobile homes. It doesn't have to be a primary residence. It can be a second home, a cabin, a lake home. And the requirement is the equipment must meet the Energy Star requirements for ground source heat pumps, and you have until 2017 to capture this tax credit. So that's a very strong incentive for the ground source heat pump industry on the residential side. There's also a strong tax incentive on the commercial side. On the commercial side, there's a 10% tax credit. That tax credit can be taken as a one-time payment if you don't want to wait for your income taxes, so you actually can get a grant for the 10% from the federal government or a check from the federal government for 10%. And even more importantly, there's a 5-year accelerated depreciation, there's an investment tax credit, and there's also tax credits for building that exceed an established energy efficiency criteria per square foot that ground source heat pumps can exceed. So we're seeing projects come in now where up to half of the geothermal installation in those commercial products are covered by tax credits. And that definitely not only levels the playing field, but makes ground source heat pump the most cost-effective system to install in commercial buildings. And that can range from your local doctor's office to a high-rise building to a hotel. So that really is taking that first cost barrier offline for ground source heat pumps. So in the 15 or so minutes we have left, I really want to talk about this final barrier, the lack of long-term and affordable financing. So let's get into that because this is where there's some really exciting things going on across the country. So this was a report that came out from the Vice President's office shortly after the Obama administration took office, and it was called Recovery Through Retrofit. The premise of this document was that to get the unemployment rate down and to get the economy going, the U.S. could make investments in energy efficiency, and that would put people to work, it would lower people's monthly bills, and it would help us on our way to energy independence. And there was a clause in there, or a piece of this report that talked about the need for new financing programs that would provide the upfront capital to get folks to do energy efficiency. And that was really the starting point for a lot of the programs I'm going to talk about here in the few minutes we have left. So some new funding tools came out of that document and the federal government's focus on making affordable energy efficiency. So one of these is a new bond that came out in 2008 called the Qualified Energy Conservation Bond, or the QECB. And the purpose of the Qualified Energy Conservation Bond was to complement renewable energy resources and energy efficiency that would make them more affordable for folks. And really the target market of QECBs are public entities, governments, public utilities that don't pay taxes but still have a strong play in promoting energy efficiency. So QECBs can go to any project that reduces, in public-owned facilities that reduce energy consumption by at least 20%. Go back to ground source heat pumps, we're seeing 40 to 50% total energy reduction. They can go to implementing green community programs. They can go to mass community retrofit programs and retrofits of facilities in government agencies and housing authorities. And the money can go to public education campaigns that result in energy efficiency. So these bonds were targeted at municipal governments and other non-tax-paying entities to promote energy efficiency, and ground source heat pump meets all of the criteria of these bonds. So how do they work? Basically, they're administered by state energy offices. The initial set-aside was $3 billion. That money's all been consumed, and programs are in place because of it. And there's a push in Congress to set aside more bond funding to do more of this work. And the way it works is the entity issues the bonds. They get up to 2% of the bond issuance to cover the cost of issuing the bond. But there's no interest on the bonds, and the people who hold the bonds basically get the tax credits that otherwise could not be used by these government entities that don't have a tax appetite. So several municipal power associations and municipal power utilities are looking into these bonds as a way to promote their energy efficiency programs. The other tool that came out in the last couple of years, which is very exciting, is called PACE, or Property Assured Clean Energy Financing. This was an idea that started in California, and it has swept the country like wildfire. The premise behind PACE is that we can fund renewable energy and energy efficiency the same way we fund sidewalks and sewer systems and whatnot. So basically, the property holders can borrow money to make energy efficiency improvements, and then they can opt in on an individual building basis to pay back that loan over time through this opt-in tax district. Now, that's a very, very powerful tool for municipal utilities and state, local, and regional governments to provide energy efficiency programs, and ground source heat pumps meet those energy efficiency requirements. Now, a consumer who takes advantage of PACE gets the added benefit of not only can they get access to this long-term low-cost financing, they can still get the full 30% tax credit on their entire ground source heat pump system. And we'll talk a little bit more about PACE. But I want to leave you with the thought that if you work with a local government that's doing PACE and they put ground source heat pumps as a qualifying measure, PACE financing can cover the ground loop, the equipment, the installation, any weatherization to go with the building as part of that installation, and the participating government entity can also recover their program costs and administration by adding on to basically the interest rate that the consumer pays back on the PACE financing. Well, PACE spread across the country like wildfire. In a year, 14 states passed PACE-enabling legislation, and 35 states have or were considering PACE at its peak. Now, a few months ago, two semi-government agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who underwrite most of the mortgages in the United States, they got a little nervous about PACE because it was so popular, and their fear was that if all these energy efficiency loans were in the property taxes always get paid before anybody else if a property goes into foreclosure. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are really owned by the federal government, kind of colluded and said, look, we won't underwrite any mortgages that have PACE encumbrance. So that kind of put PACE to a grinding halt because nobody wants to have a mortgage that they can't be resold into the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac resale market. But the folks who get it have said, well, that's not right. So here's what's going on to bring PACE back into play. And my personal opinion is we'll have PACE financing back in early 2011. The state of California has filed a lawsuit against Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, telling them that their opinion's wrong. Several different cities and counties have filed their same lawsuits. Several environmental organizations have filed lawsuits, and there's bills in both the House and the Senate that would basically remove this Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac PACE embargo, if you want to call it that. So I think we'll see PACE back in 2011. That's what my crystal ball says, and PACE is a very powerful tool to finance energy efficiency and ground source heat pumps. And I strongly suggest that if your state is on this list, that you pay attention to the status of PACE in your home state. But irregardless, there's also some leaders out there that are doing some innovative things. And let me just share with you two states that are working very hard to make low-cost, long-term financing available to energy efficiency. The first one I want to talk about is in Pennsylvania, and their program is called Keystone Help, which is an energy efficiency loan program. The state treasurer in Pennsylvania is a very clever fellow, and he figured out with today's very low interest in the marketplace, we're seeing bonds issued for you can get a $100 bond if you pay you pay $95 to get a $100 bond. He decided that there was enough spread between what the state could issue bonds for and what it could loan it for energy efficiency, that he could fund this program and the state could make money on the arbitrage of their interest payment. He could also get energy efficiency, which lowers the state's residents' total bills, which then gives them more money to spend in their economy. And he could put people to work doing energy efficiency retrofits. So Keystone Help is the mechanism they're using to fund energy efficiency in Pennsylvania. It started out with unsecured, fixed rate, 3, 5, and 10-year loans with a cap of $15,000. The interest rate was set at 6.99% for Energy Star qualified heating and cooling equipment and Energy Star windows. And then they lowered that interest rate by a point to 5.99 for heating and cooling systems that exceeded Energy Star. And then if you did a whole house improvement basically outlined by a BPI or ResNet energy auditor, you could get a 4.99% rate for a whole house improvements, that would include heating and cooling and windows. But the total package had to result in energy savings of at least 15%. Well, that program was in place for about a year, and they decided they really liked the performance and the value of ground source heat pumps. So Keystone Help came up with 2 special loans just in the last month for ground source heat pumps. And they're willing to loan up to 100% of the cost for the installation of ground source closed-loop ground source heat pump systems that meet Energy Star Tier 2 qualification standards. Energy Star has several tiers. Tier 1 basically expires at the end of this year, and Tier 2 becomes the new Energy Star requirement for tax credits next year. So if a system meets Energy Star Tier 2, you can get 100% financing for a ground source heat pump system. And the rate now for ground source heat pump unsecured is 4.99%, up to $15,000 in a 10-year term. And then the state recognized the importance of this federal tax credit, so they added to that option a tax credit anticipation loan, is what they call it, where basically you can get up to 12 payments to cover the cost of your equipment pending the return on your income taxes, your federal income taxes at 30%. So they'll carry $10,000 of basically a loan to wait till you get your tax credits back also. So that's a pretty attractive unsecured loan, very modest rates, very good term for ground source heat pumps exclusively. But they also made it a little bit better. They also have a Keystone Help secured loan program. That goes up to $35,000, and because it's secured, they lowered the interest rate to 2.875%. And this, you have to have the ground source heat pump installed as part of a total whole house improvement project as recommended by a certified BPI or ResNet energy auditor. And so when you think about that, that's a pretty good deal. So you fix all the problems in your house. You do the extra insulation and the air sealing. You put in a ground source heat pump system. And residents of the state of Pennsylvania can get up to a $35,000 loan for 2.875%. That really lowers the barrier for financing for ground source heat pumps. The other example I want to share with you is out of Oregon. The original program was called Clean Energy Works Portland, and this is an interesting thing. It includes a feature called on-bill financing. On-bill financing is a mechanism where participating utilities basically collect the loan payment for energy efficiency measures as part of the utility bill. And a true on-bill financing program, the homeowner or the business owner borrows the money for an energy efficiency retrofit, and the repayment stream stays with the meter. So if you sell your house or you sell your business, the next person in line continues to make that payment until the utility recovers their money. Now, in this case, it's really on-bill financing, but it's really what they call on-bill payment, because it's not the utility's money that's being paid back. It's the money that comes from Clean Energy Works, which is a not-for-profit that was established specifically to fund weatherization in the state of Oregon. So they ran a pilot program of 500 homes, and they offered a 20-year loan with a 5.99% interest rate for weatherization, space heating, and water heating upgrades. For folks that were lower income, they would take that rate down to 3.99% for what they call income qualified homeowners, or homeowners that needed a little extra help to make their payments. Their average loan in the beginning was $10,700. I actually talked to the lady who runs that program, and their loan amounts are getting closer to $13,000 now for the average loan. Now, the city of Portland put up the first $2.5 million to run this program, and that was a grant from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. But they've already attracted interest from some big banks, Shore Bank, Enterprise Cascadia, private fund manager, and they have 3 utilities who volunteered to help collect that money through the on-bill mechanism. So that pilot was very successful. So they've picked up another $20 million in recovery funding grant funds, and they're going to expand the program across the state. So their goal is to launch in multiple cities across the state in early 2011, and they set a goal of retrofitting 6,000 homes in 3 years. So if anybody listening today is from Oregon and you're in the geothermal business or you want to get in the geothermal business, it's a very exciting program and a very innovative program in the state of Oregon, and I strongly suggest you look into this. So there are some other funding mechanisms that are currently working their way through Congress. There's 3 big ones are called Homestar, Rural Star, and the Energy Efficiency Bank. Homestar is an offshoot of the Energy Star program, which is part of the Environmental Protection Agency and DOE. Homestar would offer rebates for energy efficiency improvements that meet certain criteria. Now, you can't get the rebate and your tax credit, but it is an option to basically have energy efficiency retrofits paid for through this rebate program. That legislation's pending in Congress. Rural Star, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, is a bill that's really targeted towards electric co-ops. And Rural Star would make funding available for electric co-ops which serve across the country to make low-interest loans available for energy efficiency in their service territories. And then the next one is what they call the Energy Efficiency Bank, where the government says, look, we really need to make money available to folks no matter where they live so that they can borrow money at low cost to do energy efficiency. So we'll watch these as they work their way through Congress closely in the next year or so. But the ultimate goal is to put low-cost, long-term money in consumers' hands so they can pay for energy efficiency retrofits that provide positive cash flow. Well, let's spend the last few minutes we have talking about electric utilities and their role in the ground source heat pump market. So the electric utility faces some serious pressures. They're under a mandate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact, hundreds of coal-fired power plants have either been closed or their new construction has been suspended so that the utilities can meet these carbon reduction goals that are being given to them by the government. They've also, in a crisis, well, maybe not a crisis yet, but they have to deliver peak load management, because if you don't build new power plants, then the only way to meet your peaks is to make sure they go away. So there's a national demand response program that's underway through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and there's a lot of attention being paid to utility peaks. And then lastly, they've been asked to be a tool to both increase energy efficiency across the country and do their part for energy independence and to help create jobs through energy efficiency. So let's go back to this slide we saw earlier. Ground source heat pumps reduce kilowatt hours by 33%, cut summer peak demand by 43%, and improve utility load factor so that the utility basically can generate more revenue for the same amount of fixed plant. So utilities are recognizing that ground source heat pumps are a tool that they can use to meet all of these objectives. So let's review here. Ground source heat pumps can give utilities significant peak load reductions. It depends on what part of the country you're in, but we see 500 watts to 800 watts per ton of installed ground source heat pump in residential buildings. So that means in the southeast, an average house could save 2 kW of peak demand, of summer peak demand, which is the same thing as a large solar PV system. An improved load factor, which and all that energy savings results in lower carbon emissions, and it basically, ground source heat pumps meet these big efficiency, renewable energy, and employment stimulation goals. And ground source heat pumps are the only technology that can do that without putting pressure on electric rates. Now, I don't want to be a spoil sport, but while most of us are trying to come out of this economic slump, there's some folks that actually are looking into the future. In this case, it's the National the NERC, the National Energy Regulatory Council, and they're looking into their crystal ball, and they say, when we come out of this economic funk we're in, we might run out of electricity. We might not be able to meet peak loads. And so their forecast is, and this is pretty frightening, that in 2017, if the economy gets back to where it was in 2007, Florida, the Southeast, parts of the Great Lakes and the Midwest, and most of the southwestern Sun Belt may have power demand from a strong recovery that could be 8% or more above the current projections, which are based on slow economic growth. And if that jump in demand occurred in a year or two, the hardest pressed regions could not add enough new power plants or transmission lines to respond in time. That's a polite way of saying if we aren't careful, we could have brownouts and blackouts based on peak demands that we can't meet because we haven't built power plants. So this little chart shows when utilities peak, and these are from across the country. This is when does a residential home really peak? Well, that's between 5 and 7 o'clock at night. So folks come home, they turn up the air conditioner, they turn on the big screen TV, they start cooking dinner, and the home peaks are at 5 to 7 at night. Well, some of the renewable energy systems out there, including solar photovoltaics, really aren't producing much energy at 5 to 7 o'clock at night. So the only technology that really clips that peak at that point in time is a ground source heat pump. Well, Oak Ridge National Labs has looked at all of this data, and they came up with this report in 2008, and they basically said, ground source heat pump loops really look like poles, wires, and natural gas pipelines. And they said, basically, why are we expecting building owners to finance these ground source heat pump installations up front when it should be the same as other utility infrastructure where the financing occurs over 30 or 40 years from utilities? So if you think back, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, but then he had to invent the electric utility industry so he could sell light bulbs. We're kind of at that point now where utilities need demands response and energy efficiency, and maybe they're going to have to finance the geothermal loops to make that efficiency show up. So that leads us to what we call the utility geothermal loop concept, where utilities are starting to look at why don't we own these geo loops, let the heating and air guys hook up the systems, we'll contract out with the drillers and the loop installers to put the loops in, and now we can get these peak demand savings and these carbon savings that we're being asked to get in a big scale way, and the customers will get utility scale service and pricing. Now, this is already a reality for electric co-ops. Back in 2007, there was an amendment to the Food and Energy Security Act that basically authorized the Department of Agriculture and their Rural Utility Division to finance ground source heat pump loops as an energy efficiency measure. And any co-op in the country that wants to borrow money from the Department of Agriculture can get under 4% financing for 35 years to own ground source heat pump loops. Not to be left behind, we're starting to see municipal utilities do the same thing, the most recent one being the city of Wyandotte, Michigan. And they just announced that they're going to offer a geothermal loop program because it helps them reduce their customers' energy bills, it improves the operation of their electric utility service, and it helps them meet their environmental benefits. And they just announced that program in August. My understanding is several other cities in Michigan are considering the same thing. Well, I told you we'd come back to the Rural Star bill. That bill would give co-ops, if it passes and it's in both houses of the Congress, $4.9 billion in loans that they would borrow at 0% interest, and then they could make that money available to consumers for up to 3% for 10 years for energy efficiency upgrades. So there are many co-ops across the country that are saying, why don't we do a loop tariff for the loop and this 10-year 3% loan for the equipment and basically offer 100% financing for geothermal systems in our service territory. In Colorado, we have an interesting little statute. Anybody can come to Colorado, file their paperwork with the Public Utility Commission, and they can start selling ground source heat pump loops for a monthly fee. That's legislation that can be adopted in any state. And then in Oregon, I just want to finish with a couple of comments. We're starting to see programs that are truly rebate-driven that don't make economic sense are running into some political problems. In this case, Oregon had a very generous program for rebates for solar systems. They had to cut that rebate program in half to balance their budget. In Arizona, they had a program that was very generous utility-paid rebates, and at the end of the day, those rebates are paid by all the ratepayers. And so basically, when the PV system was next to free, a lot of people wanted it. But then the money ran out, and the corporate commissioner, the person in charge of utility rates, said, you know, we understand that this giving big rebates and then running out of money is frustrating, but we want you to remember that the solar industry wouldn't exist without rebates. Well, the geothermal industry is not in that position because we don't want rebates. We just want help with the financing. So I think the future looks really bright for geothermal heat pumps to continue to grow with all these initiatives we've talked about. Here's some resources you can go to if you want to learn more about the technology. And then lastly, I want to leave you with this Desire USA is where you can look up incentives by your individual state for ground source heat pumps to see what your state's doing and what your neighbor states are doing. So with that, I think we're ready for some questions.
Thanks, Paul, for a great presentation. Let's get to some of those questions that have been asked throughout the presentation. Is there an interest in providing the option of leasing the entire GHP system to customers, whereby the installer is the owner and caretaker of the geothermal system, to alleviate the upfront cost?
The answer to that is definitely yes for commercial installations, and especially in the market that's, I'm going to call it institutional facilities. So schools, government buildings, not-for-profit hospitals that don't have a tax appetite, a third-party agency can come in, lease the entire system, and that third-party agent owner can actually take advantage of those federal tax credits where the not-for-profit entity cannot. So that's called the ESCO, or Energy Services Model, and we're starting to see a lot of interest in that, especially with this 50% federal tax savings on geothermal equipment.
Great. Now, a company in Birmingham, Alabama says they are providing commercial financing, and they're very interested in financing commercial applications. But they're finding very little interest from dealers and contractors in offering this option. How should they get the dealers involved?
That's a kind of a frustrating question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I tell you what. My contact information is on here, but I think that it might very well be that if you can't get your local folks interested, certainly all of the manufacturers have the ability to kind of go down into their channel to help make that happen, whether it requires training or putting a meeting together or whatnot. So if there's anybody who wants to do a geothermal installation and they're frustrated because they can't find the support they need locally, I guarantee you that there are enough engineering companies and bigger installation companies that are anxious to do that work that, contact a manufacturer and we'll work with you to make that happen.
Now here's kind of the flip side of that. How can people get their utility to consider a geothermal program?
That's a great question. And the answer depends on I'm going to call it the flavor of the utility. So let's start with the easiest ones. If you're an installing company and you happen to be a member of a rural electric co-op or a municipal utility, you can go to that co-op board or that municipal utility board or the city council or whichever the governing body is. They look forward to people coming in and talking to them. And as, for lack of a better word, member-owned or taxpayer-owned organizations, you just need to show up and tell the story. And I think you'll get their interest. The investor-owned utilities are a little bit different because they're regulated by public utility commissions. So there's two avenues to approach. One is you have to show up and talk to people to make things happen. So every investor-owned utility has a program manager that's responsible for demand response or energy efficiency, and you need to make a few phone calls and find out who that person is. And/or make a phone call to your public utility commission and find out who the staff person is in charge of energy efficiency and renewable energy programs and enter a dialogue with them. Most investor-owned utilities have to go through a process every year or every 2 years or every 4 years where they have to submit their resource plans, where they say, here's our future demands, and here's how we intend to meet them, either with new generation or energy efficiency. And those are always an opportunity for the public to get involved and say, how come you're not considering? So at the end of the day, you have to get active, and you have to participate. But I think I found across the country that if you show up and you state your case and you show these benefits to the utility and society, you'll be heard.
Okay. Now, another person wants to know, what about GHP for a church? How would their rebates or incentives work? Are there any particular for them?
Well, churches are unique, and first of all, some applications maybe aren't for geothermal. So if it's a church where the congregation comes once a Sunday, that may not be you may not save enough energy to really justify the geothermal. If it's a facility with a school or where there's always people in the building and there's always an energy demand, then obviously geothermal is an answer. But again, the church would then fall into that not-for-profit status where you really couldn't take advantage of the tax savings because you don't pay taxes. But that might be an opportunity for you to find someone in the community that would do one of these leasing agreements, and so you don't have to come up with the upfront financing, and then they can take advantage of the tax savings.
Okay. One member of the audience commented that they get a number of calls from people who are worried that their insurance won't cover the loop. How much of a significant difference would there be in risk assessment for geothermal versus other HVAC systems?
Are we talking a residence or a commercial building?
I believe this is residence because he wants to know how homeowners can resolve this issue.
Okay. Well, first of all, the loop is buried underground. And so, it would take a pretty severe disruption to do anything to the loop. A good friend of mine from a large utility company actually showed a picture at a show I was at last week where a home had been taken out by a hurricane. It happened to be in Gulf Power in Florida. And had a picture of the homeowner happened to be a utility employee, and he was holding up the flow center that was still attached to the outdoor unit that was held together by the loop in the ground. So I think the risk of losing your loop is inconsequential, and in many cases, loops have survived fires, they've survived earthquakes, obviously hurricanes. So I really wouldn't worry about that, the loop part.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question here. What % of ClimateMaster systems use variable speed compressors versus fixed speed?
I think all of our new TT line is the variable speed compressors and then the fans. And I'd have to dig out the catalog, but everything we really are promoting high efficiency stuff, which is basically 2/3, 1/3 compressors. Not true variable speed, but compressors that are, I'm going to call it high-low speed, so full partial load, full load. And I got to tell you, there's some really exciting stuff that's in the lab that'll come out that's going to blow people's socks off.
Okay. We really do have time for one more.
Okay.
Why do you think PACE financing will be reinstituted?
I think it's too good of a thing to not be reinstituted, and between the lawsuits and the attention of the federal government, that the pressure is going to be on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to bring it back. And at the end of the day, energy efficiency is just as important to society as sewer plants and sidewalks. So I think Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac overreacted, and again, this is my personal opinion. And I think that the political pressure and the legal pressure is going to make them reevaluate their position. And at the end of the day, a home that's energy efficient, those homeowners are saving money on their energy bills. That makes them a better borrower because they have more cash flow to pay back their mortgage payment. So I think it was a sort of a reaction to a program that was growing faster than they had chances to really think their way through it. And I think when you put all those factors together, we'll see PACE come back.
Great. Well, this concludes today's webinar. Please join me in thanking Paul Boney for his excellent presentation.